Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. Well, it's a world that's very misunderstood, according to my guest today. There are all kinds of misconceptions, outlandish stories, and rumors that are rampant about them. But whether you've paid any attention to this subculture or not, their numbers are growing. Some estimates put it at hundreds of thousands of participants worldwide. I am talking about furries. Furries. Maybe you've heard about them or you've seen them, and the whole thing, well, maybe it strikes you as a bit strange or weird or perhaps even dangerous. People wearing animal costumes, real or imagined, and engaged with one another either online or in person. There's been ongoing research about this furry phenomenon. It's called the International Anthropomorphic Research Project, and Professor Courtney Plante is part of it. Courtney is a professor of social psychology in the Department of Psychology at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, Quebec, and joins us. Hi, Courtney.
It's lovely to be here.
Okay, let's start off, and why don't you explain what a furry is in a little more detail?
Sure. So a furry is a fan. It's a simple way of putting it. Think of it like a science fiction fan or an anime fan, right? So a fan of Star Wars is a person who likes the movies or the shows enough that they identify with it. A furry is the same thing, except instead of being a fan of a particular show or a particular genre of cartoon, they're a fan of media that features walking, talking animal characters, anthropomorphized animals. So think Bugs Bunny, Mickey Mouse. If it's got an animal that's doing human things, furries might be a fan of it. That's kind of the unifying feature of it. And everything beyond that is just sort of a manifestation of that interest, the same way you would see manifestations of other fan-like interests. So science fiction fans go to conventions, furries go to conventions, anime fans dress up as their favorite characters, furries dress up in fuzzy animal costumes. So it helps to think of it like a fan group, fan culture or a fan group.
You know what? I think that's the key thing that people latch on to. The fact of that, I guess many, or I don't know, may dress up either completely or partially as animals, right? That's a component of it.
Yeah. So I would say that the if you want to sort of draw an analogy, fursuiting is those mascot style costumes you see. Fursuits are to furry what cosplay is to anime or to science fiction. So certainly you can be an anime fan and express that interest by dressing up as a character, or go to a science fiction convention and dress up as a character. But that's not what makes you a science fiction fan or an anime fan. And certainly there's a lot of fans of things who don't dress up, right? So you can love Star Wars ever since you were a kid, but never once have had the desire to dress up as a stormtrooper. That's the same thing for furries. About 40% of them have a fursuit. So it'd be kind of incorrect to say that furries are people who wear fursuits, because by definition, you'd be excluding most of the community. But it's true that some percentage of the community, about 40%, do manifest this interest by wearing the fursuit.
Right. And you yourself are a furry?
Yes. So I'm in the unique position of both being a person who researches furries and a member of the community. They started at about the same time.
Yeah. And so tell me about your, I think it's called fursona.
Yeah, so I do have a fursona. It's actually a really good demonstration of how furries often imbue these fursonas, these furry personas, with elements of their own identity. So I happen to be a scientist. So my fursona, Nuka, has a lab coat. He's blue because I'm colorblind, and blue is one of the few colors that I can see. And he's a cat because I like cats. So very few of these decisions are arbitrary. Oftentimes they're deep and significant and meaningful to the furry.
And how often would you adopt that personality, or that persona, I should say?
So it kind of depends on the furry that you're talking to. So for some furries, a fursona is just a nickname. Like it's just a name or a handle that you use when you're chatting with people online, or a gamer tag if you're playing games. For others, it's a way of life, right? They, for some people, they're only really known by their fursona name, and they have a whole backstory and personality, and they've tied their friends and their romantic partners up in the character. So yeah, it's kind of runs the gamut. In the same way, again, with other fandoms, you can just sort of passively be a Star Wars fan, or you can be known as like this particular name, runner of this local group of stormtroopers in this area or something. So yeah, it's a gradient.
Yeah, I mean, when you say then that some people are wrapped up in that identity, do you mean like 24/7?
I think it'd be very rare to find a furry who's like 24/7. I guess, I always kind of say when the convention's over, or when at the end of the day, furries go into work on Monday and they are typically their normal selves, right? So, in the same way that you can be a dyed in the blood, sport fan, but on Monday you go into work. You might not be wearing your Montreal Canadiens jersey if it's not appropriate or whatever in the workplace. So furries are very much like that. The vast majority of them, it's a hobby. It's the thing they do in their spare time, but they haven't lost touch with reality, or it's not like they're blurring the lines between fantasy and reality. They know, hey, I'm at a convention hanging out with friends, or hey, I'm at the office. This is not the time to go buy Sir Mittens or something.
Okay, because I think, because you've addressed right there, I think one of the misconceptions that people have, I think people think a lot of furries are just totally identifying with being an animal, and they're kind of lost in that whole persona.
Yeah, so there's furries do make this very strong distinction between like this is a character versus this is me in my day-to-day life. So a really important distinction: furries do not think that they are non-human animals. There's actually an entire category of people not related to furries called Therians, who identify in whole or in part as non-human animals. They would say there's something about me that's not entirely human. Maybe I've got the spirit of a wolf trapped in a human body or something. But that's not what a furry is. In fact, most Therians would be deeply insulted to be called a furry. And a lot of furries would say, hey man, I just put on a costume for fun on weekends, right? I don't want to or think that I'm an animal. So it's easy to sort of see how people, see a person dressed up as an animal and think, oh, that person must think they're an animal. No more so than a person puts on a stormtrooper outfit and thinks, I'm actually a stormtrooper.
Yeah. And and there's another, I think, belief or perception that people have, and that is that, being a furry, that's all about kinky sex. Like that's why people are into being a furry. It's about that the whole sexual aspect. What do you say to that? What's the research say about that?
So it's easy to conflate these ideas, sort of for two reasons. One is that furry as a community is very sex positive. So it has its roots very much in the LGBTQ community, in the science fiction community. Both these communities are very open, very positive and tolerant communities. And as such, furries speak very openly about their sexuality. And so when you see a person who speaks openly about their sexuality, people often look at that and say, that's one of those weird kinky people I've heard about. So that's one reason. Another more important reason, I think, is that furries as a group are fairly stigmatized. This goes back to a paper that I published a couple of years ago with my colleague Stephen Rayson, looking at this idea of prototypicality of fans. The simple version of it is, when I say fan, people picture default generic fan. That's like a sport fan or music fan. That's the fan group against which all other fans get compared. And the further you stray from that, the more people start looking for some kind of explanation. Like, okay, why don't you like a normal thing?
What do you mean? What do you mean by the further you stray? Stray from what? Like, what are we straying from?
Yeah. So from the prototype. So again, so the default for most people, when I say fan, coming to mind is like, oh, football fan or basketball fan or Taylor Swift fan. There's this sort of range of like normal, acceptable, mainstream interests that most people think of when they think of fan. And so as long as your interest kind of hovers around that orbit, people go, oh, okay, I get that. That makes sense. But as soon as you start getting further and further from that in terms of content, people start needing an explanation. People start going, well, that's weird. That's not what I think of when I think of a fan. And they start looking for explanations. And usually the more deviant the group is from that prototype, the more of a stretch it seems to be. Like the more you need a bigger, more out there explanation for it, right? Model trains, that's a really weird thing to be a fan of. And so it's not enough to just say, oh, they just have different tastes. People go, no, this must be a mental illness thing. This must be some kind of a kink or some kind of so people go looking for extreme explanations for what they perceive to be extreme behaviors, even though, when we've looked at the psychology of it, it's people are fans of the things they're fans of for the same underlying reason. The motivation is the same.
Yeah, I want to get into that research in just a bit, but still staying on this point, do you think that people have trouble with it because being a furry and even perhaps wearing a costume is wrapped up in an identity, right? Like a visible identity.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a fan of baseball or trains or whatever, that's something kind of an external object. You're not necessarily, you could dress up in a pitcher's outfit or whatever, right? But you're still, you're not that pitcher. You're not, right? You're emulating. And so maybe people have a concern with that. And especially, as well, it's not as if you're adopting a human form.
There's an extra layer of distancing.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that coupled with as well, unlike other sorts of cosplay. So think of like a person cosplaying as their favorite character in anime or science fiction. Usually it's like it's a dress. It's a thing you wear. But oftentimes the face isn't obscured, right? Maybe there's some makeup or something, but usually the face isn't obscured. I think what throws people off even more and adds that extra degree of like, this is different from the norm is the full mascot fursuit style head usually obscures the face. And people get really squicky about it when they see, I can't see who's behind the face. That weirds me out. Even outside of furry context, if you've got like a mascot outside of a company or whatever, that throws people off when they go, I don't know who's in there. And that kind of weirds me out. So it's kind of touching on a couple of pressure points that make people kind of uneasy. And so their head goes immediately to, this is some kind of deviance. This is some kind of extreme, weird sex kink thing. And that could be the only explanation. That's what people assume.
Yeah. So then tell me what is the attraction to being of a non-human form like a furry? What's the attraction there?
Yeah. So there's sort of two parts to the answer. One is there's no accounting for aesthetics. Some people just like chocolate. Some people like vanilla. Some people like shows where all the characters are very grounded. Other people like space or, wild fantasy worlds. And so for furries, there's just a certain appeal to the idea of it aesthetically or just the fantasy component of it. Some people like the idea of, from a science fiction perspective, crash land on a planet full of animal people. Isn't that neat? Or maybe there's a nostalgia component to it where it harkens back to the cartoons of our youth, right? Many of us grew up with Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse or Pokemon. And we think, wouldn't it be fun to live in a world where your cat could actually talk to you and you could understand them? For still others, there's a piece that we're just working on right now and hoping to publish this summer, also suggesting that a lot of furries, being queer. So furry is a very queer culture. A lot of furries have this sort of history of being bullied and picked on and ostracized when they were younger. And you can imagine how a person who's been sort of picked on by their fellow humans might find comfort or refuge in these fantasy worlds where animals, my cat has never said a mean thing to me or a hurtful thing to me, right? So a lot of furries will say, hey, I just kind of feel like I get animals a little better than humans sometimes. And so we found some evidence to suggest that, people, not just furries, but people in general who have a history of being bullied or ostracized tend to anthropomorphize their computer, their pets, their cars more, in part out of loneliness, in part out of just trying to sort of seek that comfort that comes from connections to other beings. And so,
that's really
if you don't find it with people, you find it with non-human animals.
Yeah. And you're right. And because humans can be cruel, whereas animals, yes, you're right. We find comfort in animals, in our pets, in fairy tale and fantasy animals. Yeah, that's very interesting. And that association as well, you mentioned, with childhood. I can see sort of the pros and cons of that because, there's often, I guess, safety associated with some of the things in our childhood, like the fairy tales and the imagination, those stories. Um, but from other people, I could see if they didn't understand what, furry fandom was about, they see that as maybe, someone who doesn't want to grow up.
Or
Like,
they're
why
out of
would you
touch.
want to
Yeah.
wear an animal costume, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's this to an outsider looking in, right? They kind of get it and they say, oh, I remember liking cartoons. I can see why a person might still like that. Or there's this, grow up, you got a real mortgage to pay. What are you doing clowning around like this? There's this interesting phenomena in our society, though. And my colleague Sharon Roberts on the team actually sort of studies this. It's the transition to adulthood. And what's been happening in the last few decades has been the sort of delaying of the transition to adulthood. So long gone are the years where you turned 18, you moved out of the house, you got a career, you got married, you got kids. And by 25, you got 3 kids and a house, right? That doesn't happen anymore. More and more people are living with their parents for longer. They're going to college for longer. They're struggling to break into the job market. And so across society, the 20s has sort of become this prolonged period of trying to transition into adulthood. And I think that we as a society have started to understand that carried with that are some of the hobbies and interests that are kind of considered childish. Look back to things like, when I was growing up, being a fan of Lord of the Rings or Star Trek or comic books, right? Was really uncool. You got beat up for liking that in high school. And nowadays you can go to the theater and be part of the millions of people worldwide who watch Lord of the Rings in theater or the new Marvel movie in theater. It's no longer uncool for a 30-year-old to be a comic book fan the way it was decades ago. So I think society is starting to change a little bit and understand as these people sort of grow up that, hey, you don't have to completely let go of these things. And I think it's because more and more people are experiencing that delayed transition into adulthood.
Do you think, is it a way of coping as well?
Yeah, I would say in parts, because the real world is a kind of dismal prospect for a lot of people. Gen Z in particular is coming into a particularly nasty place when it comes to economics and foreign policy. If you're LGBTQ in particular, it can seem like there's a lot of backsliding on the horizon. And so there's comforts in sort of retreating to some of the hobbies, some of the things that they may bring you comfort in a world that's otherwise kind of bleak sometimes. But even more important than that is the community. And I think that often sort of gets lost in these conversations about fandoms and furry specifically, is it's really easy to get lost in the trappings of it, in a fursuit or a plush animal or a cartoon or a drawing, and think, well, that's what it's all about. But humans are an incredibly social species. We're a species that thrives by being part of tribes and groups. And we've evolved that way. And so we kind of take it for granted that people just have these communities. And as society becomes increasingly fragmented, as we move out to the suburbs, long gone are the days of the bowling league or having a drink with the friends at the local pub after work. People are feeling this isolation and they're trying to find these communities. And so for furries in particular, they find that not in their church groups, not in their local neighborhood communities, but through their fan interest. It's kind of the excuse to get them in the door. And then once everyone's kind of there, you have the shared hobby, but also more significant friendships and bonds can form between people. So I think that's a big part of the draw too. And that facilitates this transition into adulthood when you've got this social support network around you.
Now you've studied that, right? About the community, the relationships. Well, like what have you discovered as far as, the benefits of being part of this community for people?
Yeah. So it's, again, the first instinct people have is they look at furry and say, what's wrong with this person? They must be broken people. How do you explain this? And when you actually look at what compels furries, what draws them to this, some of the reasons are things you might expect, right? Okay, it's escapism, it's fun and recreation, but a big part of it is the belongingness, is the community. That's like number 2 or 3 for the motivation. And that's where the benefits come from. One of the best predictors of happiness and well-being and longevity in a person's life is having a social support network, people who are there for you when the chips are down and life gets tough. And so it's easy to say, well, these are the people who you watch TV shows with, or the people you dress up and go to a convention with. But when you go home, and you go back to reality on Monday morning, these are also the people who are giving you a couch to crash on when your house burns down, or a shoulder to cry on when you've broken up with your partner, or they're lending you money for rent if you're having a tough time. And so it's these social support networks that are incredibly important, and that a lot of society doesn't have. Furries kind of have that in spades. And so,
Oh, really? So are you finding that those ties are very strong
oh,
among
absolutely.
furries?
Yeah, it's no coincidence that among furries, many of them say they find their significant other through the fandom, right? Or they find these sort of found families through these communities. And so again, it's really easy to trivialize or look at it just very superficially and say, this is a weird little hobby, little fixation for this person. But the significance of the friendships that people make through this and the relationships they form is very real. I always kind of joke, the colorful animals and stuff are just the excuse for everyone to get together in the first place. And once they're in the room together, the real human relationships really start to flourish and form. And again, when you go back home on Monday, you keep in touch with the people you met at the conventions, and these communities, they remain.
Mm-hmm. And you were saying earlier that there's a significant percentage of furries that are LGBTQ2 plus, right? Like what percentage would that be?
Depending on where you put the boundary and stuff, anywhere from about 70 to 80%. Yeah. So it is majority LGBTQ plus. Yeah.
Right. And then what about also, because I've read about people with autism, many of them might be drawn as well to a furry community.
Yeah, so we tend to find in our fan research more broadly, so we study other fandoms as well, as I've sort of alluded to. And across all fandoms that we've studied so far, we tend to find that people on the autism spectrum are much more represented than in the general population. And you might think, well, does being in a fandom somehow make you autistic? And the answer is no. Being furry or being an anime fan didn't make you autistic. But what's likely happening is one of the criterion, or one of the features of autism is like strong, specific, focused interests in something. And what is a fan if not a person with a strong, very specific hyperfixation on something? So if you're autistic and you're something of interest to you is cartoons or animals, well, you're going to get along really well with other people who share that hobby, especially since one of the norms of the community coming up in this LGBTQ sort of community, coming up in science fiction communities. These are both very progressive communities. Norms of inclusion and acceptance and, hey, come as you are, makes it so that if you are autistic, it's a very welcoming place for you. So a lot of autistic people find comfort, not to mention, to go back to the fursuit thing, if you are autistic and you do struggle with things like reading social cues or maintaining eye contact, a lot of autistic furries will say that a fursuit is a really good way to not have to stress out so much about these social norms. If you struggle to make eye contact, if you're in a fursuit, no one can tell that you're not making eye contact. Or if it's kind of weird for you to talk to people, if you feel kind of awkward, a lot of fursuits just don't talk. They pantomime. And so, or if you have sensory overload, if you get overloaded very easily in places, a fursuit head is like a big helmet, right? It kind of deprives some of the senses. Things are a little quieter, lights are less bright, and it can make it easier to be in social settings. So, autistic people and neurodivergent people more broadly get a lot out of the fandom as well.
Yeah. I'm also, how long has furry fandom been around?
So it kind of depends on where you put the starting point. If you're saying like, when did they start going to conventions and stuff? I think the first furry convention was in the late 1980s. But an interest in anthropomorphism as a concept, that goes all the way back to ancient deities and stuff. So, but if you want to say as a fandom, it's sort of an offshoot of the science fiction and anime fandoms. It starts to come into its own in the late 1980s.
Late 1980s. So since then, I don't know, what's happened with stigma? Is it not good still? Is it better for furry? What's
so there's been this sort of transition. So in the early days, I think furries were just completely off the radar, right? They were this weird offshoot of the science fiction fandom that unless you were a science fiction fan, you didn't even know they existed. And even then, if you were a science fiction fan, you had to go to the right convention to find a room party with furries at it or something. And then as the internet came around, furries kind of boomed. It was, before the internet, you had to kind of know someone who was a furry in order to stumble into it. With the advent of the internet, it became easier to share stories, to share arts, to start forming meetups. And then furry started to grow quite a bit as a community. And with that, you started to have popular media started to pick up on furries, right? So in the early 2000s, as word of these furries kind of hit mainstream media, there was this fascination with telling look at these weirdos, look at these freaks. So there were all sorts of shows that were doing a furry episode where they would, bring in a bunch of people in badly constructed fursuits. And this was like a bunch of non-furries' idea of what might happen at a furry convention. And usually it was pretty bad.
Yeah.
And so, throughout the 2000s and I think the early 2010s, there was a lot of look at the freaks and let's all laugh at the freaks. And then in recent years, the media images kind of changed from look at the freaks to, well, hey, hold on a second. This doesn't seem so bad. And as it's growing, it's starting to edge towards mainstream acceptance. And it's almost at that tipping point where, 30 years ago, you got beat up for being a Star Trek fan, and now it's commonplace and it's within the realm of acceptable interest to have. Furries tiptoeing towards that, although there has been some backlash in the last couple of years as furry, given that it's got a very strong LGBTQ presence, has sort of been scapegoated by a lot of politicians looking to sort of quash down on things like trans rights and LGBTQ issues. Furries are kind of an acceptable target, right? Oh, we can't pick on trans people necessarily, but we can pick on furries and say, oh, this is where the LGBTQ movement leads us, is to things like furries in school. And so there's been sort of this attempts to scapegoat furries by politicians.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I think most people, they hear of a story, right? Where they know someone who knows someone. And and there, there's stories go around about furries in schools, like, children who insist on, wearing a costume, maybe it's a cat costume, and they want to be accommodated with, drinking out of a bowl of milk, or they're using a kitty litter. Like, what do you make of those stories? Because I hear them.
Yeah, like it's the darndest thing. Everyone swears that they, that they've heard that, and yet no one can track down these elusive people, right? It's a friend of a friend of a friend, or I know a teacher who knows someone, but like we can never seem to track down these elusive cases of someone demanding to be.
Well, do we know? Have you researched this? Like, are there any stories?
We can't find like the stories, but we can't track down any evidence that whenever you start digging into it, it turns out, oh, well, it was a friend of mine. It was a friend of a friend. One of the original ones that keeps coming up is this kitty box or kitty litter box, right? Yeah. And this insistence, and it goes all the way back to like a decade ago, where I think it was like Joe Rogan's show or something, he was talking to someone who supposedly had a friend who worked at a hotel, who supposedly at a furry convention swore he saw a litter box. Like, so again, we're getting to like third or fourth hand information here. And the reality is, this is the really truly sad part. There's a kernel of truth to that. And the kernel of truth is that in some American classrooms, you will find litter boxes. People go, aha, got them. The real reason those litter boxes are there is much more tragic. It's actually because of mass shooting events. In the case of active shooting events, especially in like elementary schools, if they're going to be under lockdown for several hours, you don't want kids having to go to the bathroom. And so those litter boxes are in there for a much more tragic and unfortunate reason. So you can imagine why politicians might want to deflect from the actual reason and say, oh, it's those furries. And again, furries are just weird enough that when someone says, oh, it's the furries, most people go, oh, that tracks. That sounds like a believable story.
When you said earlier about, a significant portion of furries, LGBTQ2+, there might have been a history of bullying, right?
Yeah.
And so then I think, so now if you're a furry and there is some stigma around it, like, why would you want to disclose that and get bullied even more?
Yeah, and indeed, there is some evidence that we've got about the tendency to be very strategic in concealing your identity. A lot of furries kind of play that close to the chest, and they say, if my friends are cool, if my parents, if they seem like they're cool with it, then I'll let them know. But a lot of them are kind of worried, and not a coincidence. A lot of furries are LGBTQ. They'll say, coming out as a furry is very much like coming out as being gay or being trans, and a lot of them say those both kind of happen at the same time when they came out to their parents or to their families. And there was very much the same kind of apprehension. And a lot of the ones who say, I don't come out to my parents as gay, will also say, I don't come out to my parents as being a furry. So they sort of draw that analogy and say, hey, I'm very strategic in it. I don't bring it up in the workplace necessarily, or I won't bring it up among some of my friends who might not take it so well. Yeah. And I think it's because of the stigma. It's because of the concern that it might not be taken well, or people might not understand what it is, or might assume the most unsavory, uncharitable thing about it. Yeah.
So then now why are you open about it? Because you're open about being a furry. And also, don't you even dress occasionally in class in your
once a year I'll wear a fursuit. I don't do this every day for teaching. I'm a serious professor who actually teaches a course.
Hey, wait a minute! You could be a serious professor and be dressed up as a furry.
Also true.
Come
on. But like when I'm teaching specifically a lecture about fandoms and fan culture, then I will, to make a point, I will wear the fursuit. Right. I'm in an incredibly privileged position. I'm a tenured professor, which grants some job security. I'd be a lot more hesitant to do it if I were not tenured. But also, my family, I'm in a privileged position because my family is very accepting of me and who I am. And they've always kind of said, hey, this makes him happy. And, he's doing well in school and stuff. So, he's perfectly happy. Why stop that? But also, I don't think I could ever fully get away from it. My hobby became my research focus. And so, at some point, disentangling them would just be impossible. So I kind of had to bite the bullet and just say, well, yeah, I can't separate my name from the fact that I study this peculiar thing.
Right.
And so I kind of took the plunge.
Okay, but what about, because I've been on your site, the First Science site, and you've got a bunch of researchers, right, doing this work from all over. So how many of you are furries?
I'm the only furry on the team at the moment, on the main core team of co-founders. We do have collaborators who are also furries, but of the core founders of First Science, I'm the only furry on the team.
And the research that you do, how, I guess, strong is the research you do? Is it peer reviewed? Is it published in reputable journals?
Yeah, it's a really good question to ask, because a lot of people will say, oh, he's a furry doing research on furries, so of course it's biased, of course it's slanted. And yes, so one of the reasons why most of my colleagues are not furries is because it helps to keep it balanced, right? If I was trying to write some puff piece for the furry fandom to justify my hobby, well, they would say, well, they have no vested interest in it. And say no. And then, once we publish paper, or we write papers, we publish them in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And the people who peer review our articles have absolutely no vested interest in trying to puff up furries or anything like that. So yeah, it does get reviewed and published in peer-reviewed journals. So it is science. It's real science. I often kind of joke that it's my job to take very seriously, more seriously than I think anyone else does, something that is very superficially kind of ridiculous looking or seemingly trivial. But when you dig down into it, there's a lot of real substance there that deserves to be taken seriously.
Do on your site as well, I noticed that there is a section for parents where you address concerns that parents might have of a child being a furry or coming out and saying they're a furry. And so I wondered about that. And, how big a concern is it if you have a category like that parents are actually concerned about children being furries and how to handle it? It must be real.
Yeah. So, first of all, I want to definitely shout out there's a group called Moms of Furries who worked in conjunction with us to produce that part of the page. And so they are, as the name suggests, they are moms of furries who, they're a fantastic group who their kids got into furries, and they like any parent, what is this thing my kid is getting into? So they went to furry conventions with their kids to sort of, suss this out and see what it's all about. And they realized this has been wonderful for our kids. And so they put together these resources and sort of informed by our research to kind of say, hey, parents, like if you're apprehensive about this, check it out for yourself. Like no one's saying go in blindly and just listen to what these people have to say. Go to a convention. Conventions are more than happy to have parents come there and accompany their kids and say, hey, see what it's about. Like, don't just throw your kids blindly into this thing. No one would ask you to do that. But yeah, the research that we have is showing that, a lot of these things are very beneficial, especially for younger people, again, teenage years going into your early adulthood, as people are struggling, especially if you're queer, struggling to figure out who you are and to find your community and a sense of belongingness. The fandom provides that for folks. And so we tell parents that, yeah, it's treat it the way you would treat any other hobby. If your kid said, hey, mom, dad, I'm a Star Wars fan, or I'm getting really into anime, it might not be your cup of tea. You might think, oh, why didn't he get into something normal like, football or fixing cars? But, be supportive of it, right? If the fact that they're coming to you and sharing this with you suggests that they trust you. And that's a sign of a good relationship, right? If they're hiding this from you, it might suggest that, hey, maybe they're concerned about the way you would react to it. And maybe that suggests that you need to think about that. Like, why are they scared to come to you about this? And since it goes so hand in hand with things like being LGBTQ plus, right? Would your kid be comfortable coming to you if they were trans or gay? And if so, maybe that's a part of your relationship you may need to work on.
Is there anything that a parent should be concerned about if their child wants to be a furry? So I'm thinking of like age, is there a concern with any ages, maybe someone particularly young, or also just, and this is not, relegated to furry online communities, but any online community, right? And not knowing who's at the other end. And I'm just thinking, if it is a furry, you don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
So are there,
So, not unique to furries, but in general, right? So the fandom is predominantly a lot of adults, a lot of late teenage, young adults.
Right.
And it's the same advice I would give to, hey, my kid is getting really into, mechanics and, they're hanging out with a bunch of mechanics at a garage or whatever. Like, well, vet the place, make sure you know the people, maybe go with them a couple times to see what it's all about. If the kid is 6 years old, right? Maybe you want to be a little bit more judicious about, who you let him hang out with unattended, right? The vast majority of furry conventions have events and programming for younger people, right? They also have events and programming that's like not safe for work for adults and stuff. And so it might be like, hey, just, and they monitor. So like if you're 16 years old at a furry convention and there's an 18 plus panel, you're not going to accidentally walk into that panel. They have people at the door to check for those sorts of things. But as a parent, right, accompany them, take an interest in your child's hobbies and sort of go with them and figure it out. And if your kid is saying, hey, there's a house party that a bunch of furries are holding, well, anytime there's a house party of adults, it doesn't matter what they're gathering for, 4th of July or the sporting event, right? Like, be judicious. Would you want your 14-year-old going over to a house party of a bunch of rowdy 20-year-olds drinking beer? Probably not, right? So, I'd say no more caution than what I would recommend for anytime there's a mixed group of teenagers and adults. Be mindful, be judicious. Pay attention. Are these people that your kid knows, or are they random strangers they're meeting online? Anytime you're meeting people online, be judicious. It doesn't matter who this person is or what the community is. Be mindful of that.
Since you've been a furry, what how have you benefited? Like, what's the community given you?
For me personally?
Yeah.
I can speak to the fact that my two housemates or roommates are furries. So this is very anecdotal, but when I moved out to Quebec, I moved here from where I was sort of born and raised, and I didn't know anyone out here. So I moved out here, new job in a part of the country I'd never been to before. Very isolating and lonely experience, especially since I had the misfortune of doing so right at the beginning of the pandemic. So very ill timed. I'm in a place where I don't speak the language, where I don't know anyone. I'm at a new job, and the first thing I did, find a local furry community. And that's exactly what I did. I found the local furry group, and within a couple of weeks, I had a small little community of friends that I could hang out with. And again, it's a testament to the fact that these are real relationships 5-6 years later, they're my roommates and my romantic partner. And, these are significant and, we don't go around the house just talking about, like, we talk about the mortgage. We talk about, our jobs and stuff and, the price of groceries going up. Like, these are the things we talk about.
Right. Well, I'm sure saying, oh my God, that costume is itchy and hot. That can only go so far.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. We talk about very human, very normal things. But being furry was the thing that got us all in the room in the first place. It was the excuse for me to go to a place where a bunch of folks who have a similar interest in me hang out. And that got my foot in the door. So,
that is so, today, is it pretty easy if you live in like a half decent sized, I guess, city or town that you can find a furry community?
Yes. I would say so. Every province in Canada has its own like provincial furry group. So there's an Ontario furries group, there's a Quebec furries group, an Alberta furries group. And then even within most major cities, you kind of get these critical masses of furries that kind of cluster up, right? So it's sort of when there's enough furries, you can do things like, hey, let's all go to a restaurant or a bowling alley or a swimming pool or, go for a walk somewhere together.
And would that be true like of North America, Europe?
Yeah. So all over the States, same thing as well. There's in virtually every state, there is a state furry group and then many cities, universities even. It started to happen in the last few years now where furry's becoming bigger and bigger, that even specific universities can have this sort of critical mass of furries. I know that Stanford University, Berkeley University, I think possibly McGill. I don't remember if McGill has one, but there's this sort of, a handful of furries can start up a little group and it becomes this little, the kernel, the core of a community that gets built around it. And then, in Europe, there are, national, there's French furry group, German furries groups. And then within each city, there are often groups as well. So if you move to a new place and you're a furry, usually that's the first step is go find your local group.
I wonder too, because you said that you study other kinds of fandoms, right? Not just furry fandom. Yeah. Do you think, given the accessibility of online communities, like so many different kinds of communities, right? That you can reach people all over the world. So that's one, like the technology, artificial intelligence, but also the fact that we seem to be more and more removed from like direct human contact, but we still crave connection, right? Even though we're removed from direct, we want that connection. We have the accessibility of online. Do you think we'll be seeing more and more like different kinds of online communities, different fandoms that are like unique and diverse?
I think that, they'll definitely be growing, and I think there'll be more appreciation for them, if nothing else. I think as we go towards social media, I think, has been this crutch that we've been leaning on, where again, people move out to the suburbs and people, put up fences and become more distant from one another. Yeah. We're craving that social interaction, and social media can only get us so far. There's only so much you can get out of a Facebook post or a Twitter exchange with someone. Substance needs to come from it. And I think that fandoms and these little niche communities are starting to become more valued for that, because people realize, hey, this isn't just like an exchange that I have with someone on Twitter and never talk to them again. Like, these are people who I can keep coming back to. And again, the reason for it is just the excuse to get your foot in the door, right? You can see these communities popping up around recipe sharing groups, right? Or car mechanic groups or something. People are looking for communities and craving communities. Mm-hmm. And these communities of niche interests kind of give the excuse to build a community around. What's more promising is when those communities afford the opportunity to interact in person, right? It's one thing to just kind of talk as part of a forum with a bunch of people who have the same interests, but it's another thing when you can organize in-person events and hang out in physical space. And that's when those real like the real meat of being able to get benefits start to emerge. Because again, the person online that you chatted with a few times can't necessarily lend you a couch to sleep on or be a shoulder to cry on necessarily. But when you've met a person in person and they're in your community and you can see them, that affords more of these opportunities for social support when you need it.
Yeah. Do you think that these furry communities are here to stay? That it's not just something that's a trend and eventually it's just going to die out?
Yeah. I mean, if anything, we're seeing the furry community just getting more robust and bigger and stronger than ever. I think the only thing, and this is sort of a big debate among a lot of fan communities, not just furries, the big debate is that as the community gets larger and potentially breaks out into sort of mainstream status, does it become a little bit diluted, right? You start to introduce I guess the equivalent of like fair weather fans, right? If you're a diehard fan of a sport team, ride or die, you're there even on the really bad seasons. Those fellow fans are the ones who like you can count on to be sitting there next to you season after season after season. But when it becomes really trendy, then you run the risk of a person who kind of comes in and they're gone in 3 months. And if so I think there's some concern about among furries and other communities that are we going to lose this core as the interest gets bigger and bigger? And you might have more people who are kind of coming in, dipping their toe in and going, okay, I'm done. This is a phase or a fad that I'm done with. I don't personally think that you're going to lose the core of what makes the fandom. It's just going to be bigger.
Yeah, I mean, because I was just even thinking when you said that, with conventions, it would have started in the 80s. And so if you think about who are the people who were there on the ground, like they might be in their 60s now, right?
Yep. And many of them are still around. Many of them are still going to conventions, or if they can't make it out to conventions anymore for health reasons or whatnot, they're still chatting online with their fellow furs, or they're many of them are living with their fellow furs. And that's one of the beautiful things is, again, it's the excuse to get in the room. But now 40 years later, maybe you don't go to the convention anymore, but you're still surrounded by those same people. It's become a community.
Okay. I just thought of another advantage too, because as they get old, like they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s, who knows, right? Their furry outfit and their persona stays young. Young the whole time.
we do have some research on subjective aging, and we do find it's actually this funny mix where, because we have this big range of people within the furry fandom, young folks all the way up to older folks. And what we find is everyone wants to be about 30 years old, between 25 and 30. That's the sweet spot. So for younger furs, they have personas that are older, and for older furs, they have personas that are younger, and everyone's shooting for being about 25 to 30.
25 to 30. That's very interesting.
Because when you're 17 or 18, right, you want to be taken seriously. You don't want to be seen as a kid. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Well, listen, it was fascinating speaking with you, Courtney. Thanks so much for enlightening us about this.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
That's Courtney Plante. He's a professor of social psychology in the Department of Psychology at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, Quebec. Now, if you'd like to know more about Courtney's research and fur science, you can check out our show notes. Thanks for listening today. You can follow us on social. Our handle is @CRAM Ideas. And we'd also very much appreciate a financial donation to keep us going. If you'd like to make that, you can visit our website, cramideas.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time.